Academy of the Sacred Heart was a big part of my life growing up in St. Charles County. I was a student there for 13 years. No, I wasn't held back. I know that's what you were thinking. I was there from kindergarten through high school, or we used to call it academics. In fact, I graduated the year before they closed the high school in 1972 and began admitting boys. I suppose my father always wondered why my mother insisted that I attend a private all-girls school and pay tuition to do so when there was a perfectly good public school just down the road from the family farm, run by none other than Miss Willie Harris herself. The reason I was sent to the academy was that my mother was a devout Catholic, a staunch believer of Catholic education, and an ardent worshiper of St. Philippine Duchenne. She made sure that I went to Sacred Heart, even if it meant that she would have to spend her own money, her egg money, and learn how to drive a car. And she did, and I did, and I'm thankful for it. I'm going to introduce today then Sister Margaret Munch. She's a graduate of the Sacred Heart School of Omaha, Nebraska. She has a love for Philippine and is a noted authority on all things Philippine. And Theresa graduated from the Academy in 1967. She went to Maryville and returned to teach at the Academy in 1971. She taught in several grades and then became the school librarian in 1990. She retired from teaching 5 or 6 years ago, but continued on in the part-time position of school archivist. Now, Theresa, maybe our paths didn't meet up very much during our time at Sacred Heart, but I think we both have the same roadmap now as being archivists. Please welcome Sister Margaret Munch and Theresa Grass.
Thank you so very much. Sister Munch and I are happy to be here, and we consider it an honor and a privilege to share the story of Philippine Duchenne and the Academy with all of you. The title of our presentation is The School on North 2nd Street, the Academy of the Sacred Heart in St. Charles History. And our story begins in early September of 1818. The 5 nuns had left France 6 months before, traveling by ship, paddle boat, carriage, and cart. They had endured storms, poor food, illness, uncertainty, disappointment, and anxiety. They had traveled from Paris to Bordeaux, across the Atlantic to New Orleans, up the Mississippi to St. Louis, and were at last looking across the Missouri River toward the town that was their destination, their new home, St. Charles. In 1818, it was exciting to be in Missouri. Lewis and Clark had returned from their epic journey westward with fantastic tales of a new land filled with opportunity and previously unknown peoples, animals, plants, and terrain. Enticed by Lewis and Clark's stories, Americans had the notion that the way west was ultimately the way east, to the Pacific and China and the magical countries of Asia. And they believed that the Missouri River was the route by which this destination would be achieved. And best of all, for Missourians, the town of St. Charles was considered by many to be the eventual hub of the westward migration. At this time, Missouri was still a territory of the U.S., but there was talk of its becoming the most important state in the country, if all went well. And St. Charles would be the capital of this key state. So after months of traveling, of dreaming of America, of promises and hope and anticipation, 5 French nuns were at last at Les Petites Côtes, the little hills of St. Charles. They were members of the Society of the Sacred Heart, a religious order founded in 1800 by Madeleine Sophie Barra. They had been promised a school in St. Louis, a city they had heard of, but Bishop William de Burgh, who had asked them to come to his huge diocese of Louisiana, had had second thoughts about establishing a school in the Mississippi River town. For one thing, even after all his promises, he had not been able to find a suitable house for the nuns. So he looked further afield and decided that St. Charles, on the fabled Missouri, and soon to be a booming metropolis due to that strategic location, would be just the right place to establish a new school. So here they were, Mother Octavie Berthold, a 21-year-old who had been born in Switzerland and was fluent in Latin, Italian, and English. Mother Eugenie O'Day, 27 years old and from a noble family. She had made her final vows on the morning the nuns left Paris. Sister Marguerite Manteau and Sister Catherine Lamar, both 39, who were to take care of the household duties while the others taught. And of course, Mother Philippine Duchesne, aged 49, who was the superior of the little group. Since childhood, Mother Duchesne's dream was to come to America and teach the Indians. Missionary priests returned to France and spoke about the natives in Louisiana. One of them, Father Jean-Baptiste Aubert, told about his experiences in Kaskaskia, Illinois, and Philippine said,
"My first enthusiasm for missionary life was roused by the tales of a good Jesuit father who had been on the missions in Louisiana and who told us stories about the Indians. I was just 8 or 9 years old, but already I considered it a great privilege to be a missionary. The words foreign missions and the names of priests destined for them and the religious in faraway lands made my heart thrill."
Now at last, Mother Duchesne and her companions were nearly at their destination. They had set out for St. Charles along the King's Highway and onto the St. Charles Road in a carriage accompanied by Bishop de Burgh and a caravan of horses, cows, hogs, and pens of chickens. By the time they arrived at the ferry, one of the cows had fallen into a ditch and had to be shot. In Mother Duchesne's first letter to Madeleine Sophie Barra, her superior in France, she wrote of an encounter with the Indians along the King's Highway on the trip to St. Charles.
"We met a group of them who are going to make a treaty with the representatives of the states in St. Louis. They followed us as far as the river, kissed the sisters' hands, and continued watching us until we reached the other side of the river.
The ferrymen also impressed her, and she said,
Those who ferried us across the river and took all our luggage by cart to the house would not take a sou, saying that we represented our Lord Jesus Christ."
Again, Mother Duchesne wrote,
Having made the rounds of St. Louis, St. Genevieve, Florissant, and St. Charles, we are now settling down in the last place, which seems to put us as far away from you as possible in America, because of the many halts and detours one must make in order to get here. Monseigneur Dubourg looks very far into the future, considers this place quite important, as it is the largest village on the Missouri, about 20 miles from this junction with the Mississippi. American settlers from the eastern states are constantly pouring into this section of the country. Restless people who hoped St. Charles would become a great commercial link between the United States and China.
As they walked up the hill from the ferry, the nuns saw the cabin that was to be their school. It was owned by Madame Marie-Louise Duquette, the widow of the trader Francois Duquette. He had a large home built in 1794, and it soon became a busy place as Francois used it for business as well as the family house. The building was constructed of upright posts resting on a low stone foundation. It had a slant roof of pegged shingles extending over the 5-foot gallery that ran the length of the front and back. A stone chimney and fireplace warmed the cabin. Reverend Timothy Flint, who lived in St. Charles for several years, recorded his impression of the Duquette mansion.
The town is partly visible from this retirement, although the noise is not heard. The river spreads out below it in a wide and beautiful bay adorned with an island, thick set with those regular cotton trees which so much resemble trees that have been planted for a pleasure ground. The trees about the house were literally bending over under their load of apple, pears, and the yellow Osage plums. Above the house and on the summit of the bluff is a fine tract of high and level plain covered with hazel bushes and wild hops, a great abundance of grapes, and red prairie plums.
The Duquette building, which was called a mansion because it was so large, had been converted into a boarding house after Francois died in 1814, so it was considered an appropriate place for a school and convent. It had one large central room with 3 smaller rooms on each side. The nuns used the main room for the convent, parlor, and schoolroom. A chapel, which was very important to the nuns, was set up in one of the smaller rooms. Riding back to France, Mother Duchenne noted,
We are very inconveniently lodged. This is 2,000 francs for 7 little rooms in poor condition, a large garden, orchard, and wood, all going to ruin for want of attention. We would have great need for a French gardener. Our baker and carpenter are French.
she also felt that they had arrived at
The village, which is the most remote in the United States, situated on the Missouri, which is only frequented by those who trade with the Indians. We are very near them, yet I have not seen any little Indian girls since we have been here, that is, a month.
And so it was here, on September 14th, 1818, that the first free school west of the Mississippi was opened for the girls of St. Charles. Mother Duchenne told her superior, Mother Vera,
In our free school, composed of 22 children, in proportion to the population, this is equivalent to 100 in France. They know nothing of the existence of hell or of our Lord Jesus Christ, his birth or his death. They listen open-mouthed. I have to say constantly, it is true, nonetheless. Except for 2 of them, they are all at the alphabet stage.
the boarding school opened October 3rd, when 2 Pratt girls, Emily and Therese, and their cousin, Pelagie Chouteau, arrived at the little school. The cousins were the only boarders that year because other St. Louis parents did not want to send their children so far away. 20 miles and a river crossing made for quite a journey in the 1800s. Life at the new school began in earnest. The nuns not only taught, but as Mother Duchenne wrote back to France,
We dig the garden, carry manure, take water to the cow, clean the little cow shed, the only one in the country where all the animals wander wherever they will.
eventually the nuns were able to buy a second cow, which provided milk for the students. Mother Duchenne said,
We were warned that these cows would become frenzied if we kept them near us. They have behaved very well and follow us around like 2 large dogs. They even try to come into the house.
In February 1819, after a remarkably mild winter, Mother Duchesne noted.
The weather has been beautiful since we arrived, but I am told there are often furious winds and thunder and some light earthquakes. There are also fires in the woods and the prairies when the grass is tall and dry. One night, the Americans of St. Charles had to keep watch to prevent the fires sweeping into the village. In autumn, we saw it all around, and in the forest opposite us on the other side of the Missouri.
During the winter, wholesome food and firewood were not readily available. She wrote,
Our garden and orchard are a wilderness. It is impossible to get through them. We live on potatoes and cabbages as most highly prized dishes. There is no market. A pound of butter and eggs are like a fortune. At this time of the year, which is the hunting season, we can get venison and geese, but in the spring and summertime there is nothing but salted meat and fish. Many cows, but practically no milk. Ours hardly produce enough for the 3 boarders. If we try to buy some, it is so difficult to find at 12 sous a bottle, and in the winter, 25 sous. And with all this salted food, we have no water. Our well is dry. We have to get water from the Missouri at 12 sous per journey for 2 small buckets.
As time went on, Bishop de Burgh realized that the St. Charles School was not attracting enough boarding students to make it profitable, and so he asked the nuns to move the school to Florissant. Mother Duchesne was very disappointed at this and wrote,
We see these poor, underfed children often arriving barefoot in severe frosty weather with no other clothes than a thin dress with nothing underneath. We find it painful to leave these children with no help. They are such promising pupils. In 4 months, some of them have learned to read, write, to know the whole little catechism, a number of hymns, and the prayers at benediction, where they take complete charge of the singing.
Mother Duchesne's hope was to have a day school at St. Charles and a boarding school in Florissant, but that was not to be. So in 1819, the nuns and their belongings left the Duquette mansion and made their way across the river to Florissant, where a house was being built for them. More and more girls attended this school, and soon a novitiate was opened for young women who wished to join the order. Another academy was opened in 1827 near the Mississippi River in St. Louis, as well as schools in Louisiana. However, St. Charles was never far from Mother Duchesne's heart. During these years, the early 1820s, St. Charles was growing. The Jesuit order of priests arrived in 1823 to Bishop de Burgh's delight. He deeded property in Florissant to the order, and eventually the St. Charles Borromeo parish benefited from their proximity. The priest ministered to the people in Dardenne and Portage-des-Sioux as well. The original parish church by the river needed to be replaced. It was described by one young Jesuit as nothing more than a barn.
Not of stone, but of wood, without foundation of any kind, except a few stones placed under the joists to keep them from rotting.
It was decided that the new church would be built somewhere away from the river so that it would not flood. Plus, they felt that more land was needed for expansion. The 9-acre Duquette property was ideal, and so on March 8, 1825, Madame Duquette sold her house and the land bordered by Clark, Decatur, 2nd and 4th Streets for $650 to the Jesuits. The people of St. Charles rallied around the Jesuits, and eventually an 80 by 40-foot building was erected. So, shortly after the dedication of this stone church in October 1828, a parish school for boys was opened. The year before, in 1827, the Jesuits deeded the 2 northern blocks of their Duquette property, which was along Decatur Street, to Mother Duchesne in hopes of reopening the girls' school. St. Charles had always been dear to Mother Duchesne, and once Mother Béra, back in France, was convinced that reopening the school was a wise idea, plans went ahead to reestablish the academy. When the nuns, including mothers Duchesne, Berthold, Madavon, and O'Connor, arrived on October 10th, 2 days before the dedication of the Jesuit church in 1828, the townspeople greeted them wholeheartedly, waving and calling out to them. The Duquette cabin had been abandoned for the past few years and was in disrepair. Undaunted, mothers Lucille Madavon and Mary Ann O'Connor, who were the foundresses of this mission, rousted out stray pigs and other unwelcome visitors and had the windows and rotted floors repaired by village carpenters. By the second day, the central room had been transformed into a temporary chapel, and that evening, the bishop and 12 priests entered and chanted the office for the dedication of the church. The next morning, a series of masses began in the new church, and the nuns served breakfast for the priests on the top of an empty barrel. The villagers provided roasted meats, cornbread, and other frontier delicacies, and Mother Madavon was won over by their generosity. She wrote to Mother Vera in France.
We are situated in the midst of a simple, honest people who love us very much, but who are very poor. 3 towns not far away from here are larger and may send us pupils. It is astonishing the way this part of Missouri is being populated. Last year, 14,000 newcomers settled around here, and we see as many as 20 families passing our house daily, going to find homes here and there in this state.
Mother Vera in turn answered,
I hold firmly to St. Charles, and I am delighted we have a house there. It may accomplish more good than any other house.
The school opened that October, and by the end of the first year, 30 girls were being educated. A small tuition was necessary, but payment in food and service was accepted also. No child was refused, and Mother Madavon noted,
The people of St. Charles give the missionaries much consolation. They are a very docile folk. It is enough for the pastor, or the ladies, as they call us, to recommend a thing. It is done at once.
She continued,
One day I said to myself, winter is coming on. The house is very cold, for the wind blows in on all sides through the chinks in the logs. I have no firewood, and there is not a penny to spend on it. Almost instantly a neighbor drove up with a wagon load of wood. And whenever you need more, Mother, he said, just let me know, and I will fetch it for you. Another time we had run completely out of food for the cows and chickens. We had not a grain of corn. Suddenly a friend arrived with a big supply for us. And at the same time, a lady brought her little girl to place her in the boarding school and paid 6 months in advance.
She went on to say,
At the present, I am imploring divine providence to enable us to build. Our house is in such a wretched condition. When a storm rages, we fear it will collapse on our heads. When it rains, the kitchen is always flooded.
and in Mother Madavon's irrepressible way, she added,
And now, sometimes little mice.
As time went on, although Mothers Madavon and O'Connor became masons, carpenters, and painters, they made 12 benches, a table, and even a chicken coop. They realized that the decrepit Duquette mansion was beyond repair and much too small, and it needed to be replaced. Finally, in the spring of 1833, funds were raised to build a 3-story brick convent. The building was completed by January of 1836 and forms the nucleus of today's academy. In 1840, a second addition was completed. It joined the convent to the parish church and allowed the nuns to have a cloistered chapel. During these years, more boarders were enrolled, and the day school, which was practically free, kept a steady average of about 45 children. Mother Madavon remarked,
This section is being populated so quickly that our establishment should soon be in a flourishing condition, for education is more highly appreciated now, and religion is making great progress.
Meanwhile, Mother Duchenne was at Florissant and St. Louis until 1841, when she accompanied several Jesuits and nuns to Kansas to a mission for the Potawatomi Indians. At last, her greatest desire was fulfilled. She would be working with the Native Americans. She was 72 years old at this time and ill, but as she prayed and lived with the Indians, she seemed to grow stronger. After one short year, however, she was brought back to Missouri and remained in St. Charles for 10 more years. It was here that she sat by a window and watched the children playing. She prayed fervently that more students would attend the boarding school. As she sat and looked out at the river and rolling countryside, she must have remembered her first year in America. So many hopes and dreams had come and gone. By this time, there were not only Sacred Heart schools in Missouri, but also in Louisiana, New York, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Canada, and of course the Indian Mission in Kansas. And yet Mother Duchenne felt as though she had failed. She did not attribute the success of the schools to anything she had done. On the contrary, she felt that she was the least of all.
How little I have accomplished for our good master.
In 1843, when it was decided that the St. Charles boarding school would be closed, Mother Duchenne wrote,
I still hold on to some hope that our Mother General will not sanction these measures, which are so heartbreaking, especially for me. I saw the work begin here, and perhaps I will see it destroyed.
However, after 6 months, a letter from Mother Vera arrived with happy news, and the convent journal noted,
We have received a letter from our Mother General containing the joyful news that this house will not be broken up.
It was during this time that Mother Duchenne spent many hours in prayer. Even at 80 years old, she would kneel upright through several masses, giving the Latin responses, since acolytes were not always available. Whenever Jesuit missionary Father Peter de Smet came to Missouri, he would make a point of visiting Mother Duchenne. He once wrote,
I never returned from one of these visits, but with an increase of edification, with a full conviction that I had conversed with a truly living saint.
Sewing and embroidery were two of Mother Duchenne's interests, and she sent vestments and altar cloths to the missions and churches. She wrote to Father de Smet,
I trust you will accept what I am now sending you for the Indians. 2 quilts, one of them made of little stars, and some small altar linens. It is the gift of a poor person offered to the poor, who are the true friends of Jesus Christ.
As she aged, her eyesight diminished, and she was unable to read and sew. She told Mother Vera in France,
God is good, always so good. I have the consolation of spending my time in silence, close to the chapel. By the grace of God, I am still able to be up and around. Every day I am able to assist at 2 or 3 masses.
Those who saw her were often amazed by a glow that radiated from her face after communion. One old man noticed her kneeling at the altar rail to receive Holy Communion.
I never saw anything like it. Mother Duchenne is a saint.
Even in the last year of her life, Mother Duchenne was worried that the St. Charles Academy might be closed, and she wrote to Mother Vera,
I beg you to sustain this house. In spite of all the difficulties, we shall always have day pupils who pay a little, the poor children who have no other chance for education, and some boarding pupils from the vicinity, and even from St. Louis. If you could see the pretty place we have here, standing beside the church as it does, you would not have the courage to take it from us.
In April of 1852, she wrote to France,
We have enrolled a good number of new pupils, but we cannot take more than 35 without being overcrowded and risking fresh cases of illness. There is a real need for an addition to the building, and since I am so useless, I have begged God to take me to himself, as that would give place for 2 more people.
As the year went on, she grew weaker. Dr. Henry Behrens, who lived across the street, was a regular visitor. The convent supplied various remedies: elderflowers, slippery elm bark, powdered snake root, orange peel, quinine, cordial and claret, even French brandy. But all the 83-year-old missionary wanted was a little milk. Until at last, after nearly 35 years on the American frontier, Philippine Duchesne died on November 18, 1852. She was laid to rest in the parish cemetery in a plain wooden coffin made by the village carpenter. Father Peter Verhagen, the bar male pastor, who had known her at Florissant, in St. Louis, and even the Indian Mission, offered the funeral mass, with many priests on the altar and a large crowd of friends in the pews. Father Verhagen wrote in the parish death registry,
Mother Duchesne may be considered the foundress of all the houses of the Sacred Heart in the United States. Eminent in all virtues of religious life, but especially in humility, she sweetly and calmly departed this life in the odor of sanctity on the 18th day of November, 1852.
In the 1850s, the grounds of the school had some additions. A Marian shrine to Our Lady of the Pillar was built in the front yard, and in 1855, Mother Duchesne's remains were moved from the cemetery to that little building. It was thought that she should have a special memorial, and that octagonal building, which is fondly called the Roundhouse, held her body until the construction of the memorial shrine, nearly 100 years later. As enrollment increased, another addition was made in 1856. It was to the south of the original 1835 convent and was used for classrooms and a dormitory. And when you look at all of these pictures, that will always be 2nd Street in the front. So that's 2nd Street in 1856. In 1858, a brick parish schoolhouse was built in the front lawn near 2nd Street. And finally, the old Duquette house was torn down. The Civil War affected enrollment, but not as expected. It increased due to the fact that parents thought the academy would be a safe place for their daughters. Despite the additional building, students had to be turned away because of overcrowding. Troops drilled near the school, and Elizabeth Fitzwilliam O'Brien recalled an encounter between the soldiers and the schoolgirls.
One afternoon, while playing in the woods, which occupied the rear portion of the grounds, a company of mounted soldiers appeared at the gate and stood at attention. Like a flock of frightened birds, we flew to Mother Miller, who hastily advanced to meet the captain. With beating hearts, we expected every evil on the calendar, but with the greatest courtesy, the officer said, "Madam, my men have seen the quantity of fine apples on your trees, and I have ventured to ask your generosity for some." "Come in and take all you want," said Mother Miller, calling on us all to help gather the fruit. In a few minutes, all were well supplied, one of the soldiers saying to a tiny helper, "I have a little sister about your age at home. How I wish I could see her now." They left with hearty thanks and 3 cheers for the sisters.
Mrs. O'Brien's recollection also included a vivid description of St. Charles in the 1860s.
St. Charles was then a small town. Down the muddy current of the Missouri came boats from the northwest. Often we heard their shrill whistles and waited eagerly for the new pupils they frequently brought. No bridges spanned the river then, and ferry boats did a lively business. Even the passenger and freight cars of the old North Missouri Railroad, now the Wabash, were carried across by ferry. During the severe winters of the early 60s, I returned after Christmas holidays over the frozen waters in a carriage and pair. This was not an unusual occurrence.
As more and more people settled in St. Charles, the Jesuit parish church became too small to hold the parishioners, and by the end of 1870, a new brick church was roofed in. Located up the hill at 4th and Decatur, it was dedicated to St. Charles Borromeo on October 13, 1872, 44 years and 1 day after the stone church had been consecrated. The 1870s brought several disasters to St. Charles. Mother Anna Thatcher, who had been a student at the academy, and can be seen on the bottom left, the girl on the left side there, Mother Thatcher wrote later that in November of 1875, she was in the school's little chapel when
There was a great rush of feet and shouting. Frightened beyond self-control, I rushed from the chapel and was met by a man who suddenly opened the back door and shouted, "The house is on fire!" I then ran into the study hall and threw my arms around Mother Jones and cried, "The house is on fire!" It was not long before a bucket brigade was formed by the men who had rushed down from the church, which they were entering for Mass. By the time the fire engine drawn by men arrived, the fire was out. The fire was caused by a spark from the kitchen chimney on the wooden roof.
Mother Thatcher also remembered the tornado that occurred a few months later. It smashed windows, uprooted trees, tore down a wooden fence that ran across the property, and landed the courthouse's roof on the school's front lawn. Repairs were made to the buildings, including a new tin roof. The Religious of the Sacred Heart now own the property vacated by the church, and a chapel was built there in 1883. And this is Decatur. The street on the right-hand side is Decatur Street, so it would be from 2nd and Decatur that we're looking. As the school continued to grow and 100 students walked its halls, a 3-story brick building with a basement was completed in 1886. Then, in 1890, a wing to the west of the 1835 building was added. And actually, if you would be standing there about at Decatur and 2nd and look, this is what you would see even today. Pretty much, we have the chapel, which is now the library, on the right, the older buildings, and then the 1886 building on the left. All this time, the nuns had conducted the Borromeo Parish School. At first, it was in the basement below the front parlors of the oldest building, then in the freestanding school by 2nd Street. In 1892, a building was erected across from 3rd Street with the intention of moving the parish school there. However, the nuns insisted on educating only girls, and the pastor had hoped to include boys, so the parish opened its own elementary school, and the building became a laundry. About this time, a write-up in the St. Charles County Directory described the academy in glowing terms. And although I know we're running maybe a little bit late, I have to read, this is unreadable, unfortunately, but this is kind of classic, I call it. So I'm going to read a few selections from it. This was in the St. Charles County Directory in 1891. Unqualifiedly, the best educational establishment for young ladies in the state of Missouri. The academy buildings, most delightfully situated on an eminence overlooking the Missouri River, surrounded by stately shade trees and carpeted by green sward. A better location could not be asked. Acres of lawn and shade and wildwood environ the beautiful and stately buildings, and the whole, resting as it does above the dust and turmoil of the maddening crowd. And I figured that would be St. Charles in 1891. And this all affords such opportunities for study, for soul and mind expansion as the poor, tired-out denizens of the dusty city could ask. Affords an existence almost utopian by those who endure the heat and burden of the day, and the ceaseless activities of the grimy, materialistic, workaday world. And as I read this, I thought, we think we have it bad. Nothing but a visit can afford an idea of the beauty, the sweet restfulness of the surroundings, and nothing but an examination of the young ladies of this academy can give the needed proof of the effectiveness of the course of instruction. Suffice to say, they come out not only with trained logical minds, but with active bodies and with souls undefiled by rough contact with those little grossnesses which rub off the bloom of the peach, which, alas, never come again. This academy does more than make its students wise in book lore, music, etc. It makes them better, purer ladies as well as students. And I really think that we might all agree that with comments like this, it's no wonder that with the dawn of the new century, the academy prospered. The Society of the Sacred Heart had many schools around the United States by this time, but St. Charles was considered to be very special. In the 1900s, continued growth of the school called for additional buildings and changes to the physical plant. In the early 1960s, a gym and classroom wing were added, and Regis Hall, a dormitory, was built in 1967. A North Wing addition and Rao Memorial, another gym activity room, were added to the campus in the 1980s. A major change for the school occurred in 1972. The high school closed and boys were accepted into the elementary school. For a time, the Academy of the Sacred Heart and Perrier Elementary were more or less separate but equal. But eventually the Perrier name was dropped, and today the school is co-ed with single-gender classes in grades 6 to 8. Philippine Duchesne's cause for sainthood had been introduced in Rome in 1909, and eventually she was beatified in 1940. This step before canonization resulted in grandiose plans for a shrine, and in April 1951, the groundbreaking took place. And here we see Mayor, St. Charles Mayor Henry vote at the groundbreaking. On June 11, 1952, Mother Duchesne's remains, which had been moved from the little octagonal building in the front yard, were placed under the altar of the Duchesne Memorial Shrine. The plans had been much modified, and the unpretentious building was actually more appropriate for the modest, simple, and unassuming nun whose contributions to the frontier school were so admirable. It was decided that the building would not be completed, although in the 1960s, the interior was renovated in modern liturgical form. On July 3rd, 1988, Mother Rose Philippine Duchesne was canonized, that is, named a saint by Pope John Paul II. Many people went to Rome for the canonization, and this is the St. Charles Knights of Columbus there in Rome. But also many more celebrated here in St. Charles, and here are the knights in the shrine. Visitors still come to pray and walk the grounds where St. Philippine established her school and died in sanctity. The shrine is open every day, and docents conduct tours at designated times during the week. Although the grounds and population have changed greatly over the last 199 years, the school's mission continues to nurture youth and encourage intellectual, physical, and moral growth. The 5 religious who stood on the bank of the Missouri River in 1818 would be astonished to realize that their dedication, tenacity, and bravery resulted in the education of so many over so long a time. And now, as we anticipate the bicentennial of the founding of the Academy of the Sacred Heart, it is important to recognize that the school would not be here today if it were not for the generosity and support of the community. From the ferrymen who would not take money for the trip across the river in 1818 because they felt the nuns represented our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, to the settlers who welcomed and helped the school survive and thrive, to the townspeople who put out fires and cleared downed trees after tornadoes, to the city councilmen who approved the Henry Weber statue and fence along 2nd Street and Clark Street, and all the others who supported and encouraged the growth of the Academy and the vision of the founders. Really, they are reasons why the Academy of the Sacred Heart is proud to call St. Charles home. So, thank you very much. I I don't know if anyone has any questions or if we want to take time for that, but if anybody does, please feel free. Well, thank you again. It's, as I said, really been a pleasure and a privilege to be with you. And we hope maybe sometime some of you will come visit the school. I think we'll be on the house tour in September, so that might be important too. Thank you.